Hey everybody, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our instructional video on fermentation. As we watch the video, you want to make sure that you are writing down notes, either using the follow-along notes posted to Classroom, or writing them down in a separate notebook with a pen or pencil. So here we go. Now, we've been talking a lot about cell respiration and the fact that parts of it is aerobic versus anaerobic. Remember, we know that the words aerobic means to require oxygen, while anaerobic means it does not require oxygen. So the process we're going to talk about in this video is actually anaerobic, so it does not occur when oxygen is present. And so fermentation doesn't require oxygen, is an anaerobic process. And we know that when it's anaerobic, it's not going to be very efficient at transferring energy from our glucose to then ATP. And so in the end, the process of fermentation is only going to yield about 2 ATP for every molecule of glucose, which if we look at aerobic respiration, we know aerobic respiration with the combination of glycolysis, our Krebs cycle, as well as our electron transport chain, we can make upwards of 32 to almost 38 ATP for every 1 glucose molecule when oxygen is present. Now, there are 2 main types of fermentation we need to know, and one is alcoholic fermentation, and the other is lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid might be something that you've heard before, especially if you do a lot of running, if you do a lot of sports, any type of physical activity, you probably have had some experience with lactic acid in the past. Now, with alcoholic fermentation, it's actually going to be our organisms known as yeast that are going to perform alcoholic fermentation. They're going to convert pyruvic acid, right, that we know comes from glucose during glycolysis, and they're going to turn that into ethyl alcohol when they run out of oxygen. So that's why we call it alcoholic fermentation. We know that yeast are often used to make breads as well as alcohol. However, right, when we know we use yeast to make dough rise in our bread, the reason why you don't get intoxicated off of that bread is because the carbon dioxide that gets produced helps to build those air pockets and helps to make the dough rise, while when you bake your bread, the alcohol then evaporates. Now, some of the steps of our alcoholic fermentation. First step is always glycolysis. We always need to break down glucose, and that's going to turn into pyruvic acid. Now, if no oxygen becomes available, it then creates ethyl alcohol and still produces carbon dioxide. So we know, right, yeasts are going to be used in both alcoholic as well as baking industries. The carbon dioxide that is given off, we know is going to help to make that bread dough rise when we bake that bread. But as I previously said, that alcohol that gets made evaporates during our baking process. Now, what about lactic acid fermentation? You'll notice lactic acid fermentation is very similar. It always starts with glycolysis and converts that glucose to pyruvic acid. But when oxygen is not available, it's going to create lactic acid. So that pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid by muscle cells. So if you can guess, we're our type of organisms that perform lactic acid fermentation when we have a shortage of oxygen within our cells. Now, it's going to be produced when muscle cells perform strenuous exercise, because in our muscles, they're using up all of that oxygen to then provide that ATP energy. So when we begin to lose out on that oxygen, we start to get a buildup of lactic acid, and that's why you begin to kind of feel the burn in your muscles. So if you were someone who did activity number 2 the other day with our clothespin, the more and more you squeezed the pin, the quicker you should have felt the burn in your hand. And that's because you were strenuously using those muscles in your hand, and over time, they were lacking oxygen, and so lactic acid began to build up within your muscles. So now with the lactic acid buildup within our muscles, we know that this is going to cause severe cramps because we know it lowers the pH of our muscles. Remember, pH refers to whether or not something is an acid or a base. So when it lowers the pH of our muscles, it actually reduces its ability to contract. And when oxygen returns to the muscles, that lactic acid gets converted back to pyruvic acid, and the pyruvic acid will then go into aerobic respiration once oxygen returns. So that's why after you do some sort of strenuous exercise with your muscles, over time that lactic acid does go away, and then you can return to then your normal muscle use. Some other organisms that use lactic acid in this case are typically bacteria. Bacteria tends to help to create things like cheeses and yogurt, buttermilk, sour cream, pickles, and sauerkraut. And they all do that by performing lactic acid fermentation. All right, guys, that is the end of our notes. Make sure that you took notes down as you watched the video, and please mark as done on Classroom.